بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah, in our discussions of the Mukhtasar by Imam al-Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, we've reached a section of Salatul Marid, the prayer of the sick person. Now, sickness is seen as a type of an excuse that would result in certain dispensations. However, those dispensations don't only apply to the prayer, it could also apply to the fast, it could apply to many different rulings in the Sharia. The underlying basis is a verse that we've quoted a few times, that ما جعل عليكم في الدين من حرج, that He, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has not placed any undue hardship on you in the religion. So undue hardship, haraj, is something that the Sharia seeks to avert. But exactly what constitutes haraj, it must be understood. What constitutes undue difficulty? Right, so he mentions here about a sickness. Right? Now the word sickness here, it doesn't necessarily apply in the medical, the way that we understand the word sickness. Imam al-Quduri, he says that إِذَا تَعَذَّرَ عَلَى الْمَرِيضِ قِيَامٍ, that if one is unable, if the sick person is unable to stand. Right? So the marad here is a certain thing that causes the person to have an inability to stand. Right? So either that inability is in the standing, or they can stand but they can't prostrate, right? Or other things. Right? So what is the undue hardship? Right? Undue hardship is something that a similar person to yourself could not normally bear. So for instance, slight pain, most people can bear it. Slight dizziness, most people can bear it. A slight delay of one's recovery from a sickness that they already have, most people can bear it. But if it's pain to the extent that most people could not normally bear it without much difficulty, or it's such a situation of the like, then that is an excuse. Right? So once that excuse is there, right, either the excuse is going to, regarding the prayer, either that excuse is going to affect that person's ability to stand in the prayer. Right? So Imam al-Quduri, he says, إِذَا تَعَذَّرَ عَلَى الْمَرِيضِ قِيَامٍ, if the sick person is unable to stand, صَلَّى قَاعِدًا يَرْكَعُ وَيَسْجُدُ, then they will pray sitting. They will pray sitting, and they will perform the bowing and the prostration as normal. Now, there's two different terms here. One is قَاعِدًا, which means to pray sitting. Now, sitting here means to sit and to sit on the ground and prostrate, so where you make your prostration on the ground. Right? So the prostration is going to be as normal. Right? The excuse is only in the standing, then you can sit on the ground, but you must prostrate on the ground. Right? So if a person has, for instance, back problems, they can't stand in the prayer, so they must sit in the prayer, they have to make the prostration on the floor, on the ground. Right? To merely sit on the chair and gesture is not allowed. Right? It is not valid to do so, because the inability does not extend beyond just the standing, right? As we'll take in a moment. Right? So if one is unable to stand, then they are permitted to sit. However, regarding dispensations like this, they are only to the extent of the need. The dispensation is only given to the extent of the need. Right? So if someone is, they are able to stand for some time, and then after a while, then the pain starts. Or after some time standing, they start to become dizzy that they might fall. Right? But in those beginning moments, they're fine, that they could stand without difficulty. So if that's the case, then they must stand to the extent that they can without occurring on themselves the undue difficulty. Right? So if you can stand for a minute or two before the pain starts, then you must stand for a minute or two, and then once the pain starts, you sit down. Right? Because the dispensation is only according to the need. Right? And that applies even if it's just enough time to say Allahu Akbar and read one verse of the Quran, and then you have to sit down. Right? However, if standing at all causes you difficulty and there's no point whatsoever where there's time where there's no difficulty, then you don't have to stand at all. You can start the prayer from the sitting position, right? Because the need extends all the way to the onset of the standing. Now, an extension of this is that if a person, for instance, them standing is unduly difficult for them, they have pain, they have a pinched nerve in their back, they can't stand. Right? But if they were to lean against the wall while praying, then they don't have that problem. So then, right, they would not resort to the sitting, they would just resort to standing while leaning on something, because that is the extent of the need, right? That the dispensation here would just be the fact that you're allowed to lean, that you're allowed to lean on something or put your weight on something, right? And thus allowing you to do the prayer as normal. I think the plug is loose. It just keeps going on and off. Yeah. Okay, so that's in regards to the standing. Right. Now, and I reiterate that the prostration must be on the ground. The prostration must be on the ground. You cannot just gesture. Now, if a person is unable to bow or to prostrate, right, so they can stand perfectly fine, but they have knee troubles. So if they go into the bowing position or they go into the prostration, then they experience the difficulty. In that case, then they will start the prayer in a sitting position. They will start the prayer in a sitting position, and instead of performing the prostration on the ground, they will merely do gestures. They will do gestures for both the bowing and the prostration. Right. So one may ask, why is it that they don't stand? Right? The reason is that standing, right, is a type of integral that is a means towards something else. So one of the key reasons for the standing in the prayer is that it's a means of going into the sajda. That you can go into the sajda from a standing position. So if you're not going to, if you can't prostrate on the ground, then you also don't stand. The standing is because of the prostration. So if you're not going to prostrate on the ground, you're merely going to do gestures, then you would sit from the beginning of the prayer, and you would do gestures for both the bowing and for the sajda. Now when doing head gestures for the bowing and the sajda, all you have to do is move your head. You move your head slightly in a tiny slight movement with the head for the bowing, and then a little bit further for the prostration. So the prostration, the gesture for the prostration has to be further down than that of the bowing, so as to make a difference between the two. If there is no distinguishment, the same length of bowing, the same distance of bowing is the same for both the prostration and the bowing, then it does not count, because the prostration has to be lower than the bowing. Right? But it doesn't have to be extreme. You don't have to tilt your whole back over. Right? Merely just with the head is sufficient. Merely just with the head is sufficient. Right? Now, in regards to the sitting, you can sit however you wish, whatever way is most comfortable. it is best and recommended, if it doesn't entail difficulty, to sit in the same position that you would sit at the end of the prayer normally, the tashahhud position. Right? In this situation, since you are not going to prostrate on the ground, so your excuse is in regards to your prostrating on the ground. You can't do it. Your knee hurts, you have back pain, you can't prostrate on the ground. So in that situation, you're allowed to sit, and you're going to make your gestures with your head for the bowing and the prostration, and because of that, you can sit on the chair if you wish. Because you can sit on the chair and make the gestures. There's no problem with that. The issue is that if the person's excuse or difficulty is in the standing, right, then the dispensation is only in regards to sitting as a substitute for the standing. You still have to prostrate on the ground. Right? So if a person is sitting on a chair and just making gestures, that's not sufficient. That is allowed only if the excuse extends to the prostration itself, because in that case you will only make gestures for the bowing and the prostration. So you can do that from sitting on the ground, or you can do that sitting on a chair. Tamam. Right, and if the excuse is in regards to the prostration itself, then there's no standing whatsoever. You don't have to stand for you don't have to start the prayer standing and then sit down, right? Because the standing is because of the prostration. If there's no prostration, there's no standing. Then after that, Imam Quduri, he says, فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعُ الرُّكُوعَ وَالسُّجُودَ أَوْ مَاءً بِرَأْسِهِ. We read that already. That if a person is not able to bow or prostrate, then they will suffice by gesturing with their head, and they will make the gesture of the prostration lower than the gesture of the bowing. And then he says, وَلَا يَرْفَعْ إِلَى وَجْهِهِ شَيْئًا يَسْجُدُ عَلَيْهِ. But they will not raise anything toward their head to prostrate on. So if you're sitting down, you don't have to bring something up for you to prostrate on. Right? Now, if someone did that, if someone did do that, then we would see, was the extent that they bowed their head for the bowing, was the extent that they bowed their head for the prostration lower than the bowing? If so, then it's still valid. Right? So for instance, you're sitting on the ground, right, and you lift up something to kind of simulate the prostration. Right? So you bow like this, you lower your head slightly for the bow, and then you lower your head more for the prostration, and you prostrate on something. You shouldn't do it. The Prophet prohibited this. One of the Sahaba, they were sick, and they used to lift a pillow toward their head, and he said, don't do that. He told him not to do that. But if the prostration was lower than the bowing, then it's still valid. It's still valid. But it would be disliked to do so, especially if that thing wasn't attached to the ground. If it was attached to the ground, it would be slightly different, but still not something one should do. It still would fall under the same prohibition. Now then he says that if a person is not able to sit at all, right, so they can't sit on the ground, they can't sit on a chair, they can't, right, then they will lay on their back. They will lay on their back, and they will put their feet toward the Qibla. However, they should bend their knees so that the feet are not directly pointed at the Qibla. So the legs are toward the direction of the Qibla, but the feet are not extended. Right? And then they will do again the gestures for the bowing, and then a further gesture for the prostration. Now, if a person has the choice between laying down, right, or sitting on a chair, the chair is preferred. Right? And this applies also. You could sit if you can sit leaning on something or leaning against the wall behind you, then you have to do that. You can't resort to the laying down unless you absolutely cannot sit in any way, in any fashion whatsoever. Right, so if you cannot sit whatsoever, someone is in the hospital bed and they're in difficulty and in pain, and they just got an accident, or they have a broken bone, and they can't sit up, then they would pray facing the Qibla with their face this way, and they would gesture, just making the sajda further down. And it may help to facilitate that, to put a pillow behind the head. So that's one style of sitting, of laying down. The second option is to lay on the side, right? And where it's possible, right, the right side would be preferred over the left, right? Whereas the face would be facing the Qibla. So they would be laying sideways, and their face would be toward the Qibla, and they would again do the gestures, the bowing, the prostration being lower than the bowing. Now, if a person can't even do that, they can't move their head at all, they can't do any bowing whatsoever, not standing, not sitting, not laying down, right, on their back or on their side, then they don't pray. They don't pray at the moment. They leave the prayer, they delay the prayer until the time that they can do it, that they can pray it in a valid manner. Right? In the Hanafi school, there is no prayer by using the eyes. In other schools, they would allow that a person gestures with their eyebrows or their eyes, or even to يَجْرِ أَفْعَالِ الصَّلَاةِ عَلَى قَلْبٍ, or they would just go through the motions of the prayer in their heart. That does not exist in the Hanafi school. However, the person is excused they are excused in praying that prayer in the current time. They will still have to pray the prayer later once they become healthier. Now, the scholars have differed that if this excuse lasts more than 5 prayers, some scholars have given the legal verdict that they don't have to make qada. They don't have to make up the prayers. And so they don't have to make up the prayers. However, the more sound opinion is that they do have to make up the prayers at a later time. So there's a difference of opinion regarding that. Right, so if they're unable to pray, unable to make the gestures even, then they do not pray. And at a later time when they are healthier, they will make that prayer up, and there's no sin on them for that. Tamam. Now he says, he mentions, similar to what we mentioned, that if a person is able to stand, they're able to stand, they're fully able to stand, but they're not able to bow or to prostrate, then they still don't stand. They still don't stand. Right? And it is permissible for them to pray sitting with gestures. Right? As we mentioned, that the standing is only is established as a means to go into the prostration. If there's no prostration, the standing is not obligatory. Now, a second question arises that what if this happens during the prayer? Right? Somebody, they're praying, and then all of a sudden, mid-prayer, they slip a disc in their back, or they have a pinched nerve in their back, and all of a sudden, now mid-prayer, they're not able to pray standing. Right? So if this occurs mid-prayer, right, then Imam Quduri, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, in صَلَّى الصَّحِيحُ بَعْضَ صَلَاتِهِ قَائِمًا, if a person who is healthy prays some of their prayer standing, and then something occurs to them, some sickness or excuse occurs to them that prevents them from standing, then they will immediately sit down and complete the prayer sitting, but prostrating on the ground. Prostrating on the ground. Right? If they are able to. Now, if that excuse also prevents them from making the sajda, then they will just make by gestures. So mid-prayer, they will just go to the alternative. If they're not able to stand, they sit. If they're not able to prostrate, they gesture. Right? If they're not able to sit, they lay down. And the prayer is still valid, even if you started it standing. Now, if it's the other way around, you have a back problem or something's wrong, so now you turn to Allah and you're praying the prayer of need. You're asking Allah for shifa in your prayer, and mid-prayer Allah answers your dua. And suddenly your back problem is gone, and you feel like the day يَوْمَ وَلَدَتْكَ أُمُّكَ. You feel like the day that your mother gave birth to you. You feel brand new, mid-prayer. So now what do you do? Right, so he says, right, so if a person started the prayer sitting but prostrating on the ground, then if that excuse is removed mid-prayer, then they just stand and they continue the prayer. Because prostrating on the ground is the basis of the prayer. If that is there, then one can continue the prayer. However, if one's excuse that they started the prayer with was such that they had to gesture, they couldn't prostrate, then if mid-prayer that excuse is removed, they have to start over the prayer. Right? Because the underlying principle is that you cannot attach a weak state to a strong state. You cannot base a weak state on a strong state. You cannot base a strong state on a weak state. Right? So you started the prayer gesturing. That's a weak state, and you cannot add to that a state of strength, a strong state, which is standing. Right? You can do opposite. You can start standing and then end up sitting, but you can't do it the other way around. Right? But that only applies that if you're doing a prayer that you're gesturing and then the excuse is gone, you have to start over. If you're fully prostrating on the ground, then that is still considered a strong state, and you can continue the prayer from standing. The next thing he mentions is about the Irhuma. Now, Irhuma in Arabic is to faint. A person loses consciousness. Now, if a person falls unconscious or loses consciousness, right, then if it's a small amount of prayers, so it's 5 or less prayers, it's less than 5 prayers, right, then that's just considered like sleeping. Right? And sleeping, if you slept through 4 prayers, right, you would have to when you wake up, you'd have to make them up. Right? However, if you were unconscious for a long period of time, which is considered 5 prayers or more, you were completely unconscious through 5 prayer times, then you do not have to make up the prayers when you come to, because of that principle of undue difficulty. Making up all those prayers would be unduly difficult on that person, right? Whereas less than 5 prayers would not be. So once they come to, if it's less than 5 prayers, they make it up. They make up those 5 prayers. If it's more than 5, they are not obliged to make it up. We mentioned before, this is just kind of a miscellaneous note, that the person who is praying sitting and making their prostration on the ground can lead the prayer of someone who's standing. Right? The person who's praying sitting and prostrating on the ground can lead the prayer, can lead somebody who's standing in the prayer. However, the person who is sitting and gesturing with and gesturing as a substitute of the bowing or the prostration, they cannot lead the prayer. Right? Because gesturing is a weak state. Gesturing is a weak state, and a person who's in a strong state, which is a standing state, a standing position, cannot base their prayer on the weak state of the imam. However, prostrating on the ground, even if you're not standing, if you're sitting and prostrating on the ground, that's still a strong state. And the Prophet ﷺ did that. So we know directly from the Prophet that is permissible, because he prayed sitting, prostrating on the ground, and the Sahaba followed him from standing. The next topic Imam Quduri he brings is the prostration of recital or of recitation. Right? And this refers to when reciting the Quran, there are 14 verses in the Quran that are marked as verses of prostration. And if you look at the meaning of the verse itself, there's a sense of a command to prostrate or a rebuke of those who do not prostrate. So the ayah indicates or dictates that a person should prostrate at that moment. And there are 14 verses in the Quran like this. And just we've listed them here. is أعراف ورعد وإسراء نحو الإسراء مريم والحج فيها الموطن المقدم فرقان النمل سجد كالصاد حميم سجدة حميم نجم وانشقاق والعلق. So Surah Al-A'raf, Surah Al-Ra'd, Surah Al-Nahl has one, Surah Al-Isra, also known as Bani Israel, Surah Al-Maryam also has one. Now Hajj has two. The Mus'haf that most people use has two verses that are marked as a sajda verse. In the Hanafi school, only the first of those two is seen as a prostration of recital, right? Is a necessary place of recital, whereas the second one is not. And the second one is if I recall, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اركعوا واسجدوا واعبدوا ربكم وافعلوا الخير لعلكم تفلحون. Allah says that, oh, you who believe, bow and prostrate to your Lord and do good, that perhaps you will be successful. Now, whenever bowing and prostration are mentioned one after another, it indicates to the entire prayer, not just the prostration, right? And this is different than all of the other verses where it's just the mention of one. It's not both together, right? So for that reason, the Hanafi madhab and the Hanafi school, the second is not a verse of prostration, whereas in the Shafi'i school it is. Right, so the first of the Surah Hajj, right, Surah Al-Furqan, Surah Al-Namal has one, Surah Al-Sajda, which is called Surah Al-Sajda because of that, also known as Alif Lam Mim Tanzil, Surah Al-Sad, Surah Fussilat, which is also known as, there's another name for Surah Fussilat, Surah Hamim Sajda, right, Hamim Sajda, you can see the word Sajda there in its name. Surah Al-Najm, Surah Inshiqaq, and Surah Al-Alaq, right, the last verse of Surah Al-Alaq. Right, so there are 14 in total. Now the ruling is that the prostration of recitation is wajib. It's wajib. Right? It is necessary. Right? It's obligatory, right, to do, but it's a lower level of obligatory from the fard. So it's wajib to do in the Hanafi school, and it's wajib upon the one who recites it, right, and upon the one who hears it being recited. Right? And that applies to whether one intended or not. Whether they intended to recite it or not, they accidentally recited it. Right? If it was recited, it's obligatory. Or if they accidentally heard it, they unintentionally walked past somebody who was reading the Quran and they heard it. Now, the obligation right, to prostrate is only right, for the reciter is if it was pronounced. Right? If you're just reading it with your eyes, then it is not an obligation upon you to prostrate. It has to be pronounced. Likewise, if you're writing it, it is not obligatory, right? Now, the exception to this is that if it was heard or recited by someone who is not of those who are obliged to pray. Right? So if someone who is not obligatory upon them to pray, if they were to hear it, they don't have to prostrate. Right? And basically that refers to two people, and you could include a third as well. So the woman who's menstruating, right, if she hears a verse of sajda, it's not obligatory for her to prostrate now or later. If a child hears the verse, they don't have to prostrate either, right? Because the prayer is not obligatory on them, therefore the prostration is not either. Now, if a person is in a state of major ritual impurity, so janaba, they need a ghusl, and they hear it, it is obligatory on them, right? However, after they make the ghusl. Right? So even though at that current moment they are not able to pray, right, the obligation of prayer is still on them. Right? They have to make the ghusl and then pray. So therefore they'd have to make the prostration. Whereas the menstruating woman, it's not obligatory on her to pray at all. Tamam. Now, and what's excluded from this is one thing that is excluded that would be common in our times would be that which is considered a sada, an echo. Right? An echo does not make it obligatory on you to prostrate. So if you're listening to the Quran on a CD or on an MP3 or on some digital audio, right, then it is not obligatory on you to prostrate, right, because that is considered more. Now, if it's a live stream and you're watching, like for instance, you're watching Mecca live, Taraweeh at Mecca, and it's live, then you have to prostrate, right, because the ruling of the echo is not there because you're actually watching what they're doing at the moment. So it's as if you're listening to it firsthand. Whereas the recording is exactly that. It's a recording, and that is not obligatory. So, if anyone has any questions, they can just jump in. We're going to continue. There's a few miscellaneous rules that Imam al-Quduri he brings. So he says, وَالسُّجُودُ وَاجِبٌ فِي هَذِهِ الْمَوَاضِعِ كُلِّهَا. Right? على التالي والسامع سواء قصد استماع القرآن أو لم يقصد. We mentioned that. And then he mentions about the prayer, the congregational prayer. Now, there's a few different aspects here, right? So first he says that إذا تلا الإمام آية سجدة. If you're in the prayer and the imam who's leading the prayer reads the verse of sajda, reads the prostration verse, right? Whether you heard it or not, if the imam prostrates, you have to prostrate as well, because the basis of the prayer is that the follower follows the imam, right? If you're close and you heard it, then it's obvious you heard it, therefore it's obligatory on you as well. But if you're in the final row in the very big masjid and you didn't hear the verse being recited, it's still obligatory on you to prostrate following the imam. So that's one. The second is, if the follower, right, in the congregation, the follower recites it. Right? We already know, when we've taken before, that the follower does not recite behind the imam. The follower does not recite at all behind the imam, whether it's a quiet prayer or an aloud prayer. But say, hypothetically speaking, if they did, if the follower, right, blurted out, or they're reading behind the imam and they blurted out a verse of prostration, it's not obligatory on anyone to prostrate. Right? Most definitely the imam does not prostrate, because then the imam would become the follower, and that's not his role. Likewise, none of the followers that are near the person who recited, they will not prostrate. Right? So that is considered void. Now, he says, rahimahullah, وَإِن سَمِعُوا وَهُمْ فِي الصَّلَاةِ. If the people who are praying in a congregation hear the verse of prostration being recited from someone who is not in that same prayer. So someone, for instance, you're in a madrasa and you came late. So you and your few people who are with you, you prayed your own congregation. And then one of the students is sitting there and reciting Quran, and they read a verse of prostration, and you're in the prayer, right? So because you heard it, it is obligatory on you, but you do not prostrate while you're in that prayer. You do not go into the prostration in the prayer. If you did, it does not count for the obligation, but the prayer is still valid. It does not break the prayer. However, you would wait until after the prayer is finished, and then you would prostrate for the recitation, right? Because you heard it from a person who was not in the same prayer as you. Tamam. So he says, "Man rajulan laysa ma'ahum fi as-salat lam yasjuduha fi as-salat." If they hear from someone who is not in their prayer, then they prostrate it after the prayer. Right? They do not prostrate in the prayer. And if they do prostrate in the prayer, lam tujzithum. Right? It does not count for their obligation of the prostration, but it doesn't break the prayer. He says, وَمَنْ تَلَا آيَةَ سَجْدَةٍ خَارِجَ الصَّلَاةِ. If someone recites a prostration verse outside of prayer, And then, without doing the prostration, they started into a prayer. Allahu Akbar. They started their prayer. Right? And then they repeated that same verse in that prayer. Right? Then one sajda, if they went into prostration in the prayer, that one sajda would suffice for both recitations. That one prostration would suffice for both recitations. Right, now, as a kind of converse to that, right, وَإِن تَلَاهَا فِي غَيْرِ الصَّلَاةِ, if they recite a verse of prostration outside of the prayer, and then they prostrated, and then they entered into prayer, and then they recited it again, they have to prostrate again. Right, so, and this is the same ruling for kafarat, for expiations. So for instance, if a person breaks their fast intentionally in Ramadan, they have to make up that day, and they have to do an expiation, which is 60 days of fasting in a row. Right? If they did that, and they did the expiation, and then they did it again, they have to do another expiation. However, if they did that in 2019, and they did it again in 2020, but they never made expiation, one expiation suffices both of those. Right? So if they recite the verse, prostrate, then recite the verse again in the prayer, right? Then they have to prostrate again. If they recite, don't prostrate, enter the prayer, recite again, then one prostration suffices for both. Right? And this is because reading outside of the prayer and reading inside the prayer it's seen as two separate sessions. And you cannot combine the two unless you didn't already prostrate for the first one. Right, now this extends to this next ruling, which is multiple times. If you recite the verse multiple times, right, then if you recite the same verse, say you're trying to memorize Surah Alaq, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق, then you get to the last verse, right? And you're trying to memorize it, so you have to repeat it multiple times, right? So if you repeat that verse multiple times, but in the same exact place, if you're sitting in a place, you're not moving from one place to another. If you're either actually sitting in the exact same place, or effectively like you're in the same room, the same vicinity, but you haven't left, then you recite the verse 10 times, right? One prostration would suffice for all 10 because you did it all in one place. And if you do it all in one place, they kind of join together under one ruling. However, if you're walking around the house while you're trying to memorize this verse, maybe you get your motivation, your memory is stronger when you pace around the house. So you read in your bedroom, you read the verse once. Then in the living room, you read it another time. And in the kitchen, you read it another time. And in the den, you read it another time. And then you come back to the room. Right? So you read it 5 times in 5 different places. Now, then you have to prostrate 5 separate times. Because even though they were multiple recitations, because they were in different places, they all have individual rulings. Right? However, if they're all in the same place, then they are combined under one prostration. Right? And if you're reading all in the same exact place and you read it 10 times, you can read it once, prostrate, and then read the other 9, and you don't have to prostrate anymore. Or you can read all 10 and then prostrate. Right? Either way, it's only once you have to prostrate. Now this applies to the one reciting as well as the one listening. Right? And the ruling is on the basis of the person themselves. So if I'm reciting a prostration of a verse of prostration, and while I'm doing so, I'm pacing back and forth from one room to another, and Brother Zaid is sitting there, and they hear me reciting the whole time. Right? I'm moving from one room to another room to another room to another room. So that means I have to prostrate each time I recite it in a different location. But the listener has been in the same spot the whole time. Right? So no matter how many times I recited it, they only have to prostrate once. Right? And the opposite is also true. That if I'm reciting in one spot, I'm reciting the same verse 10 times in one spot, right? And brother Zayd he hears me the first time I recite it, he's in the den. And then he moves to the bedroom, and then he hears me again. Then he moves to the kitchen, and he hears me again. He moves to the living room, and he hears me again. Each time he heard it in a different gathering, that's an additional time he has to prostrate. So the ruling is on the basis of, right, the person being in the same exact place. Now, and then lastly, he mentions the method. How do you perform the prostration? The bare minimum is that you prostrate. Right? That suffices for the obligation, but there's a sunnah method to doing so. If it's in the prayer, it's obligatory to prostrate right away. Right? You do not delay it. Right? However, you can continue to read a few verses, but not if it's more than 3 verses, then that's too much of a delay. So you should prostrate right away in the prayer. But if it's outside the prayer, then the sunnah is that you stand, right? You make the takbir just like you do in the normally in the prayer, and this would necessitate that you have wudu, you're facing the qibla, your awra is covered. So all the conditions for the prayer also apply to this because it's a part of the prayer. Right? You stand, you make the takbir, Allahu Akbar, right? And then, right, sorry, without raising the hands, that's my fault. Right? You make the takbir, Allahu Akbar, while standing, without raising the hands. Then you go into the prostration as normal, so knees first, then you go into the prostration. In the prostration, you do the sunnah dhikr. Subhana Rabbil A'la, Subhana Rabbil A'la, Subhana Rabbil A'la 3 times. Then you say a takbir again, Allahu Akbar, and then you raise to the sitting position, and then that's finished. Right? Some have added that it's good to stand up once again to complete the cycle, but it's not necessary. Right? There is no tashahhud, and there's no salam, right? Because you're not initiating a full prayer, you're just doing a part of a prayer. Right? So takbir without raising hands, prostration, do the remembrance in the prostration as is sunnah, then takbir again to sitting position, and that's finished. Right? And if everyone is reading together, then they can all do it together. So, any questions here before we move on? Because we're moving to a different topic.
When hearing an ayah of sajda from someone outside of prayer, do you prostrate as a congregation or by yourself afterwards?
No, even if you prostrate as a congregation, everyone has to make their own individual, right, prostration. You would only prostrate in congregation if you're all reading together. Like if you're studying Quran together and one person recites a verse, then you all can get up. Right? You don't have to make rows or anything, but you would all do it at the same time. And the scholars, they mentioned that it's recommended not to raise from the sajda until the person who actually read it raises first. Right? It's a recommendation. You don't have to. But in the case where everyone is in prayer and one person outside the prayer recites, then that meaning is not there. Right? So everyone would just prostrate individually. Any other question?
What is the ruling if someone reads a verse of sajda, moves around, and returns to the same spot and recites it again?
Yeah, so that would be considered tabaddul majlis. Right? That would be considered a second place, a different place. It's not. Right? Once you move from one place to another, that first place is voided. Right? So it's not considered the same place. It's another place, technically. Right? But for instance, the masjid is all one place. So if you're standing in the corner of the masjid and you recite, and then you move to the other corner of the masjid, that's not considered moving to a different place. Right? A different place would be you recite in the masjid, then you recite at home, or you recite outside the masjid. Or if you're in your house and you're walking around the same room, that's not changing place. If you're walking at different rooms of the house or different levels, then that would be changing places, right? Or if you do something that would, like for instance, you read the verse and then you have lunch, and then you read the verse again, but you're saying in the same exact place, that would be considered a new time. It wouldn't be added to the first one, because it's not like, it's a better word than place would be like a same session. And a better word than place would be session. Right? So you read it in the same exact session. Right? But place does have meaning. So if you're reading all together at one time, but you're inside the masjid and then outside the masjid and then in your car and then at the store, then those would be different places too. Right? So it's either by change of place or by change of the meaning of the session, such that you did something that would void the continuation of that first session, like eating lunch or talking to somebody for a lengthy period of time, and so forth. Any other question? Okay, next he talks about the prayer of the traveler, the Musafir, and now he says, السفر الذي تتغير به الأحكام أن يقصد الإنسان موضعا بينه وبين ذلك الموضع مسيرة 3 أيام ولياليها. So there's the linguistic meaning of travel is very loose. Right? You could call anything a travel. I can say I'm traveling to the store. Right? Generally we wouldn't say something like that, but customarily. But the travel that is intended by the prayer of the traveler is the legally recognized travel of the Sharia, of the sacred law. Now that travel is what's considered the travel of 3 days and nights, so 72 hours of travel. The distance that you could traverse in 72 hours by walking on foot, right? In a moderate plane. You're not walking uphill, right? So the scholars have done us a great service, and they've mentioned that is equivalent to a distance of 48 miles. 48 miles or 77 kilometers approximately. Right? So it's the condition of it being 3 days, right, is no longer the relevant interpretation of that, meaning the distance that would be traveled in 3 days had you been walking or traveling by camel. Right? Now that distance today could be traveled in 15 minutes. Right? But still, because of the distance, that is legally recognized as travel. Okay. Now this travel, he says that the travel by which the rulings of that specific rulings are changed because of, right, is this 48 miles or 77 kilometers. Now what rules does he mean by the rules are changed by travels? There are multiple rules. There's about 5 right, if you combine them, there's about 5 rules that are changed because of travel. This legally recognized travel. 1, there's the obligation of shortening the 4 rakat prayer to a 2 rakat prayer. Right? Any 4 rakat prayer now it's necessary for you to pray 2 rakats. It's not a choice. We'll discuss that in a moment. The second, it is not obligatory for you to fast. You have permission to not fast if you have traversed that amount of time. The Jumu'ah prayer is not obligatory, but it does count if you prayed it. Same thing with the Eid prayers. And also it is not obligatory on you to slaughter for the Eid al-Adha. Likewise, as we mentioned before, if you're wiping on foot gear, right, the amount of time that you're allotted is extended to 72 hours as opposed to 24 hours for the one who is a resident. Right? And likewise, there's a prohibition for women to travel without a relative guardian, a mahram, if it's the distance of travel, so 48 miles or 77 kilometers. Right? And the scholars have given some expansion to that because of modern times, but that is the basic ruling. And when we get to that point, we will discuss that, inshallah. Right, so the distance is 48 miles or 77 kilometers. Now, when does a person become a traveler? Right, so travel is not merely by intending it. So if I'm sitting at home and I say I intend to travel, I'm not a traveler. Right? Likewise, if I get in my car and just start driving with no intention whatsoever, which is quite absurd to think about, then again, I'm not a traveler. So there has to be an intention and an action. An intention and an action. Right. And so it applies. So if I leave the city limits, I leave the limits of my city, and my intention is to travel to a distance that's 48 miles or 77 kilometers. Soon as I leave the city limits, then I'm a traveler. So say I'm sitting here at Seeker's Guidance, Mississauga, Canada, and I say in my mind, I intend to travel to Winnipeg. What is it? The Friendly State or something? Something, right? It's a nice place, nice people. So I intend to travel to Winnipeg, right? I'm still sitting here, I'm not a traveler. But soon as I leave the city limits of where I am, right, then, and my intention is a place that is 77 kilometers or more, right? As soon as I leave the city limits, I am a traveler. Rulings of travel apply to me at that moment, even though I haven't reached that distance yet. Right, so the rulings apply when a person leaves the city limits and their intention is the distance of travel, 77 kilometers or 48 miles. Right? And they continue to be in that condition, they continue to be a traveler, and the rulings of the traveler apply to them until one of two things happens. Either they intend to stay at their destination for 15 days or more, because if they intend to stay in their destination, so I go to Winnipeg, I leave the city limits, Winnipeg is very far, right? I'm a traveler as soon as I leave the city limits of where I'm at. Right? And I will remain a traveler until either I intend to stay somewhere 15 days or more, or I return. So now say I'm going to Winnipeg, right? I leave the city limits, I'm a traveler. The distance is far, but I intend that when I get to Winnipeg, I'm going to stay there for 1 month. Right? So as soon as I enter the limits of the city of Winnipeg, or whatever the specific place is, then I'm no longer a traveler, I am considered a resident, because residency is a stay of 15 days or longer. An intended stay of 15 days or longer, right? Without planning on, without traveling somewhere else within that time. Right? So if I'm going city hopping, for instance, so I travel from here, I go to Winnipeg, but I'm only going there for 2 days, and then I'm moving on to Alberta. Right? So then that is not an intention of 15 days or more. Right? Because the travel interrupted it, and I'm a traveler the entire time. Right? So that's one. Either you intend to be a resident in a certain place for 15 days or more, right? Or you return back to the city limits of your own country, your own city. Tamam. Now, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَفَرْضُ الْمُسَافِرِ عِنْدَنَا فِي كُلِّ صَلَاةٍ رُبَاعِيَّةٍ رَكَعَتَانِ. The obligation, meaning the obligation of prayer for the traveler, according to us in the Hanafi school, is that every single prayer that is originally 4 rakats, that it is obligatory for them to pray 2 rakats. It is not a choice. It is not, it's considered rukhsa majaziyya. It's considered a metaphorical dispensation. Right? However, it's not really a dispensation because you don't have a choice. It's not that pray 4 if you want, but you're allowed to pray 2. That's not the ruling. Right? If you are a traveler, your obligation is 2 rakats. 4 is not an option. Right? And the basis of this is the hadith of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, where she said, فُرِضَتِ الصَّلَاةُ رَكَعَتَيْنِ فِي الْحَضَرِ وَالسَّفَرِ. that the prayer was originally made obligatory as 2 rakats, whether you're a resident or you're a traveler. فَأُقِرَّتْ صَلَاةُ السَّفَرِ. So it was kept that way for the traveler, but it was increased for the resident, except for Maghrib. Right? So in the beginning, all the prayers were 2 rakats, except for Maghrib. Right? But then, as the prayer was evolving, right, and new revelation was coming, the prayer of the resident was increased to 4 rakats. So when traveling, it goes back to its original state, 2 rakats, except for Maghrib being 3. Now, praying more than that intentionally is not permissible. So if you're praying Dhuhr and you're a traveler, you have to pray 2. For you to intentionally pray 3, the 3rd and 4th rak'ah, it would be prohibitively disliked. Now, since the prayer is 2 rakats, right, the final sitting, which is obligatory, right, is at the end of the 2nd rak'ah. If you sit at the end of the 2nd rak'ah, for the time that it takes to say the tashahhud, you have fulfilled the obligations of that prayer. If then you stand up, right, and you complete the prayer 4 rakats, that last 2 is considered voluntary prayer. The first 2 is considered the obligation and it's valid. However, if it was done intentionally, it would be prohibitively disliked and necessary to make up. If it was forgetfully, then one would make a prostration of forgetfulness at the end. But if a person, they prayed 2 rakats and they didn't sit for the final sitting and they got up straight for the 3rd rak'ah and they finished all 4, then the first 2 does not count for the fard because they missed an obligatory action of the prayer, which is the final sitting, which happened at the end of the 2nd rak'ah. Right? So the prayer would not be valid. They'd have to repeat the whole thing, and the whole thing would be considered a voluntary prayer. It would not count for the obligatory prayer. Right, now, one of the conditions for a person to be a traveler, we already mentioned that there has to be actual travel, so they have to leave the city limits, and secondly, they have to intend that their destination is a place that is about 77 kilometers away. Right? So once they leave the city limits, they're a traveler. Now, and they remain a traveler until they intend to be a resident in any specific place, which is to intend to stay there 15 days or longer. Now, that intention of staying in a place for 15 days, there's conditions in order for that intention to be valid. Now, first, the consideration is who is the person who's intending, right? Because the only persons, if a person is traveling, right, for instance, a father and the son are traveling, right, and they're going, or it's a family trip, right? The father, mother, and the children are traveling to Disney World in Florida. Right? So Disney World is very far away. Once they leave the city limits, they're all travelers. Right? And the father and the mother, they know that they're only going to be in Disney World for 10 days. Right? So they're still travelers while they're in Disney World because they're not intending 15 days or more. Right? But the son, he sees Disney World for the first time and he's in love. He said, I'm staying here forever. That's my intention. I'm staying here forever. Right? His intention is not valid because who is in charge of the journey? The parents, not the child. Right? So that it has to be a person who's qualified to make an intention, which would be the leader, not the followers. Right? Leader, not the followers. Right? So if a child is traveling with their parents, then the parents' intention of staying or not, and then that's the requirement. Secondly, in order for the intention to be valid, the situation must allow for that intention. Right? And this is really, there's only one circumstance that this applies, that if a person is in a war, right? There's a battle going on, and the soldier says, you know what, I'm going to stay here for 15 days. Right? The state does not allow that because the nature of battle is that at any moment, right, they could be defeated and have to flee. Right? So it's either, so they're between, there's two possibilities. Either they're going to stay or they're going to go. And you don't really know which. So any intention. So they're a traveler whether they like it or not. Right? So a person who is in war, right, can't intend residency as long as the war is still sijal, still ongoing. Now, and then the final, that the place that one intends to be a resident in must be suitable for residence. Right? It must be suitable for residence in respect to that person. Right? So say a person like myself who's accustomed to city dwelling, right, or the nature of city or suburb life in Canada or in US. Right? Say I go and I travel to North Africa, right, and I get a taxi from Morocco down to Mauritania, and I say, oh, just drop me off here. I intend to stay in the middle of this empty desert, right, for 15 days. That intention is not valid because the likes of me do not reside in a place like that. Now, if I was a nomad and a Bedouin, then my intention would be valid in that situation. My intention would be valid in that situation because I am the type of person who would survive as a resident in that type of place. Tamam. Alright, and the last few discussions revolve around the prayer itself and praying in congregation. Right, so, and if a person is a traveler and he's praying or she's praying with non-travelers, right, then what is the ruling? Right, so, right, if he says, إِذَا دَخَلَ الْمُسَافِرُ فِي صَلَاةِ الْمُقِيمِ, if the traveler enters into the prayer of a resident. So the traveler is following a person in the prayer, and that imam is a resident. مَعَ بَقَاءِ الْوَقْتِ, and it's a current prayer, it's not a missed prayer. You're not making up a prayer. Right? Then the follower follows the imam and prays the prayer 4 rakats. That's the only situation where the traveler is allowed to pray the full 4 rakat prayer. Is allowed to pray the 4 rakats prayer is if they're praying behind an imam who is a local, a resident. Now that only applies to the current prayer. For instance, you show up at a city and you're a traveler. It's Asr prayer. And the imam just happened to oversleep during his qaylula, and he overslept for Asr, and he'd missed Asr too. Right? So you're praying Asr, you missed Asr because you got held up at the airport. He's praying Asr because he missed it. Right? If you weren't a traveler, that would be valid to pray that, for you both to pray that exact prayer in congregation. But if you're praying behind, if you're a traveler and he is a resident, you cannot pray behind him. It's not valid to pray behind him if it's a missed prayer. Right? And the same principle as before applies to that. If it's a missed prayer, it's not valid for a traveler to pray behind a muqim, a resident. Now, if the traveler is the one who is leading the prayer, right? وَإِذَا صَلَّى الْمُسَافِرُ بِالْمُقِيمِينَ رَكَعَتَيْنِ, right? That if the traveler is leading the prayer of the residents, then the traveler, right, prays 2 rakats. The traveler prays 2 rakats for Dhuhr, Asr and Isha. Right. However, the followers who are residents have to stand up and finish the prayer with an additional 2 rakats because their obligation is 4. Right. So they cannot take the dispensation of the traveler because they're not travelers. Now it is recommended for the traveler, the imam, who is a traveler, that after the second rakat to announce to the people that I am a traveler and you need to complete your prayer. The ideal circumstance would be to tell them that before you lead the prayer, before leading the prayer. However, if there's a possibility that people came in midway and did not hear that previous announcement, then to repeat it again after the prayer is finished. Right, so as to not cause confusion, because you make salam at the end of second rakat, and these people are all locals, they're going to say, subhanallah, subhanallah, and they're going to think that you forgot. Right? Whereas you're a traveler. Right? Tamam. Any questions here? There's just a few more discussions left. Nothing? Okay. Right. Now, Imam al-Quduri, alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, he says, وَإِذَا دَخَلَ الْمُسَافِرُ مِصْرَهُ, when the traveler returns to their home, their city, right? أَتَمَّ الصَّلَاةُ وَإِن لَمْ يَنْوِ الْإِقَامَ فِيهَا. Then they must pray the complete 4 rakat prayer, even if they don't intend to stay there long. Now this applies to as soon as they enter the city limits, right? Because they became a traveler by leaving the city limits. They become a resident by entering the city limits, right? So say, right, you live in Toronto and you're going to Ottawa. You got accepted to a university in Ottawa. So you pack up your things, right? Your intention is to go to Ottawa, which is well beyond the 77 kilometers, right? As soon as you leave the city limits of Toronto, you are a traveler, right? You drive for about a half an hour and then you realize you forgot your acceptance letter at the university and you need that in order to go. So you turn around and you go back, right? And as soon as you enter the city limits of Toronto, you are no longer a traveler, even if you're just going to go there to grab one thing and go back. Right? At that moment, say you stop home, you grab your paper, you realize it's Dhuhr time, you have to pray 4 rakats because you're home, and because it's your home, no intention is required. Right? You are a resident if you're at home, regardless of your intention. Right? Then he says, وَمَنْ كَانَ لَهُ وَطْنٌ فَانْتَقَدَ عَنْهُ. If a person has a hometown, right, and then they leave that hometown and they make another place their home residence, their primary place of living, and then they travel from there back to the first one, right, then they do not pray the full prayer, right, in either one. No, they do not pray the full prayer. There's a mistake. Once they return to the first one. Right, so you have a hometown. That's your home. You're always a resident at that home. Now, if you leave that place and you make another place your home, then this one is no longer considered your home. And this happened to the Prophet ﷺ. His home was Mecca, right? But because of the migration, he moved to Medina. Now, when he returned back to Mecca, right, he prayed the prayer of a traveler because that was no longer his home. So whatever is your home, right, if you make another place your home, your actual permanent, right, stable, established residence, then the first one falls away. Right? Now, if you travel back to that one, you are no longer you are a traveler at that place. The only way that someone could have multiple homes is if they have multiple families. And this would apply if, say a man has 2 wives that live in 2 different cities, right, and he has children, and each of them has a house. So he has one wife in Ottawa and another one in Winnipeg. Right? Then he is a traveler in between, but he's not a traveler at either one. In between, because the distance is more than 77 kilometers or more, right? Then in between he can shorten the prayers. But as soon as he enters the city limits of either one, right, then he is no longer a traveler because he has 2 homes. But that is only if he has 2 families. Right? Otherwise, if you have one family and you move your family from, say you move from your homeland in Croatia and you move to your new home in Konya, Turkey. Right? You move your whole family and your whole life there. Right? Now, if you travel back to Croatia, you're not a traveler. Sorry, you are a traveler. Tongue twister. Right? The next thing he mentions is that a traveler cannot intend residence in two places at once. So he says that if the traveler intends to reside in Mecca and Meena for 15 days, then he does not complete the prayer, right, except in the place that he sleeps at. Right? So say I'm going to Turkey. I don't know enough about the Turkish map to make that. Okay, say I'm traveling to Malaysia, right? And I am staying in Johor Bahru, however you pronounce it, and Kuala Lumpur, right, for 15 days. Right? Now I can't do that because humanly can't be in two places at once, right? Adatan. So whatever place I sleep at, that's the place where my intention applies to. So if I'm sleeping at one every night a different place, then there is no 15-day intention. I'm a traveler, right? But if I sleep at the same exact place every night for 15, and I'm intending to be there 15 days and to sleep in Kuala Lumpur every night of those 15 days, then I'm a traveler elsewhere, but not in Kuala Lumpur because that's my residence. So I am not a traveler in Kuala Lumpur. So you can't be in two places at once. Right? And then lastly, he says about missed prayers. Missed prayers. He says, وَمَنْ فَاتَتُ الصَّلَاةٌ فِي السَّفَرِ قَضَاهَا فِي الْحَضْرِ رَكَعَتَيْنِ. Right? He says that if a prayer is missed during travel, so you're in a state of travel, then it will be made up as 2 rakats even if you're home when you make it up. And if you miss a prayer in your residence, at your home or in a place of residence, then even if you travel and then you want to make up that prayer, it's made up 4 rakats. So however it became obligatory, right, it remains that way. Right, so the missed prayer is performed according to the state in which it was missed. If you missed it as a resident, you make it up as as the way a resident would. And if you miss it as a traveler, then you make it up as a traveler would, regardless of where you are at the moment. Just some last issues before we close. The scholars have mentioned that because there's a dispensation regarding the fard, the obligatory amount of the prayer, likewise the dispensation would be assumed to extend to the sunnah prayers as well. Right? So one would think that if I can pray dhuhr 2 rakats, then I don't have to pray the sunnah of dhuhr. Right? Now that's what something would come to one's mind at first glance. However, the scholars, they've mentioned that if you're traveling and you're at a state of rest, so for instance, you're traveling to Ottawa, but you got a hotel for one night, or you're staying at an Airbnb for one night, and you're just sitting there, right? And you're relaxing, you got your dinner, you got your takeaway, shawarma, hand slaughtered, right? And you're relaxing, your feet up on the couch, and so you're traveling, yes, you're the ruling of traveling, but you're really in a calm, resting type situation. You should pray the sunnah. Right? You should not leave off the sunnah in that situation. However, right, the opposite, you're traveling and you're really traveling. Right? You're on the move, you're on the highway, right? You're pulling over on the shoulder of the highway or at a rest stop just to quickly pray so you can continue your journey because you want to make it there for your talk just before Maghrib. Right? So you're in the travel. Right? Now, in that case, you leave off the sunnah, you pray the prayer 2 rakats, and then you continue because the state demands some sort of dispensation. But if you're in a state of rest and you're not in a turbulent kind of traveling situation, then you should pray the sunnahs. You should not neglect the sunnahs. Right? The Fajr prayer, the Maghrib prayer, and the Witr prayer, they do not change. Right? The Fajr prayer is 2 rakats regardless, and the sunnah of Fajr should not be left even if traveling, unless it's a really turbulent situation. The Maghrib prayer stays the same. It's 3 rakats whether you're traveling or not. It doesn't change. And the Witr prayer is Wajib, and it doesn't change. It's always 3 rakats. Right? Only those prayers that are 4 rakats will be shortened. And then lastly, there is no permission to combine prayers in the Hanafi school, to actually combine prayers. And by combining prayers, we mean that you take one prayer out of its prayer time and you put it with another prayer in a different prayer time. That is not permissible in the Hanafi school. Right? In the Shafi'i school and other schools, they allow for the traveler to either bring forward Asr to Dhuhr and pray Dhuhr Asr together in the same time, in Dhuhr time, or to delay Dhuhr to the Asr time and pray Dhuhr Asr together in Asr time, and likewise for Maghrib and Isha, the same situation. Right? However, in the Hanafi school, that is not permissible. However, if one is in a really turbulent situation, they can do what's called an effective combining. And that means that you time your prayer such that you pray Dhuhr at the end of its time, right? Just before its time goes out. So you're praying it in Dhuhr time, and then you pray Asr right when it comes in. So effectively, you prayed 2 prayers together, but both of them each were in their own respective time. Right? You did not take one prayer out of its time, because in the Hanafi school, praying a prayer before its time is not valid, and praying it after its time is considered missed, not current. So that's what we wanted to cover for today. And next week we'll talk about the Jum'ah prayer and the Eid, the 2 Eid prayers, and the corresponding issues that relate to that. Any questions here before we close? Nothing?
There's a question on Sajda Tilawah.
Sure.
Are there different Sajda Tilawahs if hearing different verses of Sajda from different people in the same place, like for a Quran teacher?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, so technically, now there's a difference. Like if it's definitely not the same exact verse, so one student's reading this verse, another student's reading another verse, and like you have 14 students and they're all reading 14 different verses, then definitely there's 14 separate obligations. Right? If it's the same exact verse and there's multiple people reading it, I would assume that's their separate obligations, but Allah knows best. Allah knows best. That would have to be confirmed with someone who has more knowledge than myself. Inshallah, we can try to confirm that. Who is the questioner? Inshallah, we'll try to confirm that and get back, inshallah. Anything else? Just as a quick note, the scholars have mentioned, and this is on the basis of tajriba, of experience, that if a person has difficulty, they're in a difficult situation and they are really in need of help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that one of the experienced and tried and tested ways of removal of that grief and that difficulty is to read all 14 verses of sajda, right? And to prostrate each one. So to read the verse, prostrate. Read the verse, the next one, prostrate. Next one, prostrate. Next one, prostrate. All 14. Right? And then the scholars, they mentioned that that's a means of removing that grief and that anxiety, and Allah facilitating that task. And that is something that definitely one can resort to. May Allah allow us, may Allah bless our hearts to prostrate. Right? And the scholars, they mentioned that when the heart prostrates, it never raises up ever again. Right? May Allah allow us to prostrate to Him with true reality, and may Allah make us of those who reach their destination when they travel in their journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they reach their destination in the best of states. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Jazakum Allahu khairan.